We've been doing a series here called Love Killers. And we've been at this for a few weeks now. We started a couple weeks ago, and this is all based off a book, some research that was done by a fascinating researcher named John Gottman. And he wrote up this research in a book called Why Marriages Succeed and Fail. And this research, one of the things that fascinates me so much about this guy is he's been studying couples for 20 years. And he has so much information about what makes marriages successful. He can actually sit down with a couple, watch them, video them, and he can predict within 94% accuracy whether that marriage is going to end in divorce. Whether a couple that once loved each other is going to end up broken apart and hurting, or is going to end up together. 94% accuracy. That is amazing. And he writes it up in this book that we actually think, we here at RiverLife think this is such a valuable book and such a valuable resource for you. We're willing to give one of these to you for free. We're going to have more copies of this. A bunch of you grabbed one last week. We're going to have more copies of this at our info table. And free, no cost, don't give us any money. The only thing you have to do is promise to go through this book with your spouse, with your boyfriend or girlfriend partner, and do some of the self-assessments in here. That there are some amazing self-assessments. If you've been around, you've heard me do a few of them here with you. And if you promise to go through those, you can have one of these books for free. They'll be out on the info table after service. And so in this book, in his research, what he found 4 big things that would destroy relationships. We call them love killers, because that's exactly what they do. A relationship that started out loving gets killed by these 4 things. And if all 4 of these things are present and they are not dealt with and addressed and changed, it almost guarantees the doom of a relationship. So 2 weeks ago, we talked about criticism. And criticism is when you attack a person instead of dealing with an issue. You make things personal. You use lots of I statements and or lots of you statements. You always, you never, and you attack the other person. That's criticism. Okay? Now, when criticism gets amped up, it becomes contempt. That's what we talked about last week. Now, contempt is this sense of feeling kind of superior than the other person. You're sort of better than them. You're smarter, you're more responsible, you're just sort of better. And then you fire these insults at your spouse or your partner to kind of hurt them. The point of contempt, this second love killer, is really this desire to hurt the other people. And I challenge you with this challenge that contempt crushes the spirit just to be right. And I think in our relationships, sometimes we want to be right so badly, we're willing to crush the other person. That's what contempt does. Well, this week we're going to talk about the third love killer, called defensiveness. Now, what defensiveness is, that's probably a word that's really common. Most people kind of have a picture of what defensiveness is. And you can probably picture right now what defensiveness looks like in your marriage or in your family. Well, for me, the last couple weeks, I've had before share about what criticism and contempt looked like in the early years of our marriage. But now it's my turn, because while she did criticism and contempt, I kind of did defensiveness, and next week's really is kind of my specialty, which is stonewalling. So I'll tell you all about that next week. But for me, defensiveness came when you're with someone who is critical or has contempt for you, then defensiveness is a pretty natural reaction. It's not justified and it's not healthy and it doesn't help the relationship, but that's sort of how you end up acting. So for me, my defensiveness came in the form of phrases like, she would bring something up and be like, it's not that bad. Guys, have you ever said that sort of thing to your spouse? Don't make such a big deal about it. Okay? Or, listen, I had a bad day at work. I just want to relax in front of the TV. Or something like, well, nothing's wrong with the way I drive. Ever said that? You get criticized for something. Well, nothing's wrong with the way I fill in the blank. Okay? And that's sort of what defensiveness looked like for me when I was getting these things, whether valid or not. And the truth is, some of them were very valid. But I would react against it and push against it and say those things like, it's not that bad. Don't make such a big deal about it. I'm not such a bad person. All of that is defensiveness. So what do you think it looks like for you? I think we all have strains of defensiveness. I think given a bad day, any one of us can lash back with something in the realm of defensiveness. So what does it look like for you? Well, John Gottman defined 8 types of defensiveness. Okay? And so I wanted to quickly run through them, and I want you to think about, what does it look like for you? And don't you be thinking about what it looks like for your spouse. No, when one pops up, don't start poking them. No, don't do that. Okay? I want you to think about which one of these really clicks with you. So the first one he talked about was denying responsibility. Denying responsibility. This is when you say things like that, you try to say things where it's not your fault. So for instance, one person says, well, you're always late. And they're like, no, I'm not late, it's just mong time. You ever had that fight in the car? Okay, that's denying responsibility. Okay? So another one is making excuses. Similar, and this one is where you say outside circumstances made me do what I did. Okay, for instance, again, you were late for dinner. We were all waiting for you. And you start saying, traffic was really bad. My boss was on my tail and I had to stay late. Again, remember, outside circumstances. There's always something outside that makes the thing happen. It's not you. Okay, so making excuses. Another one is called negative mind reading. Okay, negative mind reading. This is when you automatically assume the worst in your spouse. When you automatically assume that your spouse will say no, or they'll criticize you. Okay, so for instance, that you go and buy something and they say, well, why didn't you tell me you bought that? Well, you would have said no anyway. That's negative mind reading. You assume what the other person is going to say, and you always assume it's the worst. Okay? Number 4 is cross-complaining. Cross-complaining. Okay? Now this one is when your spouse or partner fires something at you, you fire back. Okay? So you fire a criticism back at them. And so maybe they say to you, well, you never want to go out and you never want to do anything. Well, then the other person comes back and says, well, you're so careless with your money. We don't have the money to spend. See how you fire back with something? Okay? So that's cross-complaining. Now there's something similar, another version of it similar to that called rubber man or rubber woman. Okay? Remember as a kid, you do the old saying, I'm rubber, you're glue, what bounces off me sticks on you. Usually followed up with a na 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 na. Okay? So that's rubber man, rubber woman. This is when they fire something at you and you fire the exact same thing back at them. You never listen to me. I never listen. You never listen. Ever done that one? Where you fire back the same criticism back at them. Okay, so that's rubber man, rubber woman. Okay, next, yes butting. Yes butting. This is when you start out agreeing with it, but by the end of the sentence, you're disagreeing with it. Okay, so you start out agreeing, but you end up disagreeing. So for instance, you didn't fill up the gas. I ran late because I had to stop by the gas station. You didn't fill up the gas. And it always begins with the same thing. Yes, but. Yes, but. Okay? Yes, but I had to rush home because you were running late. Okay? It's the yes, but. So you agree, but then you always fire something back at. You make an excuse that follows. So you're not really agreeing. The next one is repeating yourself. Okay? Repeating yourself. Repeating yourself. And saying it again. And then you're reiterating what you're saying. And then you repeat yourself. You ever had one of those arguments where you just go back and forth and you're saying the same thing over and over again? And both of you have become so obsessed with making your point, the conversation just goes nowhere. Okay, so that's repeating yourself. And then lastly is just flat out whining. This, you know what I'm talking about, that high-pitched, nasally sound. You begin to sound like a Kardashian. But Kanye, I don't want to go to the Grammys. Why don't you ever listen? We don't do anything fun. You just resort to whining. Okay? All of those are forms of defensiveness. Okay, so I want you to take a look at the list. Which one of them do you do? Which one of them do you do? You need to be able to see this, to know what your flavor of defensiveness is. Now, the danger of defensiveness is when you're in the middle of it, it feels justified. It feels very justified when you're in the middle of it, because most times when you're feeling defensive, you're actually feeling like the victim, where you're feeling attacked and you're feeling like the victim, so you have to defend yourself. But the problem with defensiveness, the fundamental problem with defensiveness, is it always escalates the argument. Defending yourself never resolves an argument. It always escalates. And what makes this one so dangerous is you feel justified for doing it because you feel attacked. That's what makes this one so dangerous. The other ones, most people who are critical or contemptuous kind of know they're doing wrong, but this one, you actually feel like you're doing right. You're protecting yourself. But it always escalates the argument. It never solves the problem. And it never makes the argument go away. Okay? It only makes things worse. So what's the alternative? What's the alternative to defensiveness? All of this up there that you saw, what's the alternative to that? Well, we're going to turn to one of Jesus' more popular, more common metaphors that he used. This is actually one that most people around the church have heard of before. People outside the church have even heard of this one before. And this was in the middle of the Sermon on the Mount, which is this big, long sermon. It's one of Jesus' longest recorded sermons. And he covered all kinds of tons of stuff in it. But in the middle of it, he kind of shifted into this section where he was really critical of the religious leaders of the time. These were called the Pharisees. And he was very critical of them. And he brought up a few big points and just sort of nailed them to the wall for their hypocrisy. That was a word he actually used multiple times in this section. You hypocrites. Okay? And so he criticized them for doing things to get attention. Things like praying really loudly and praying big and publicly to get attention and get praise. That they would give to needy people, but made sure everyone was watching so they could get praised. That they would fast, which would be refrain from eating. It's a spiritual discipline. But they would do it to make sure everyone knew how super spiritual they were. Okay? And so Jesus criticized them on these things. And then Jesus also criticized them on a few other things. The danger of loving money. He talked about that. And then the unnecessariness of worrying. He talked about that. And then he came up to this section that we're going to look at today. So it's in this context of being critical with the religious leaders, these people called the Pharisees. And in this metaphor, in this word picture he paints, he gives us an alternative to defensiveness. Okay. So we're going to read Matthew 7, verses 1 to 5. But before we do that, I have to switch glasses. Hang on a sec. Okay. Here we go. There we go. Matthew 7, 1-5. Do not judge, or you too will be judged. For in the same way you judge others, you will be judged. And the measure you use, it will be measured to you. Okay, so we have to pause here before we get to this. We have to pause here about this judging. This is a really common phrase. In fact, people outside the church even know this. You ever had someone, a non-Christian, say, Jesus says you shouldn't judge me. Whenever you say, if you say something they're doing is wrong. You ever had a relative or something? Jesus said you shouldn't judge me. Don't judge. Well, that's what it appears to say. But the problem there is that's not all it says. And we want to take that verse 1 where it says, do not judge or you will be judged. And we want to take that to understand we shouldn't judge people. Especially non-Christians, because unfortunately Christians are really judgmental. I don't know if you know that, but it's kind of true. It's kind of sad. Most of the people outside church buildings on a Sunday morning see Christians as really judgmental. But in this passage, he doesn't actually say, don't judge. Okay, I know what you're like, but that's exactly what it says. Okay? Okay, but let's continue reading. Okay? Read on, because what it says is, for in the same way you judge others, you will be judged. Okay? The second half, verse 2, actually talks about the way we judge, not whether we judge or not. If verse 1 really meant you should never judge another person, then he would have followed up to say, if you judge, you will be judged. But that's not what Jesus said. He said, the way you judge, that is the way you will be judged. And then he follows up with another sentence. The measure you use is the measure that will be used against you. Now, that's actually a reference to bartering. And if you've read much of Proverbs, this idea of the measure you use, that's actually really common in Proverbs. It's all over the place. And every single time when it's used, or almost every single time when it's used, the author of Proverbs is writing about using fair measures. And it talks about you should not use unfair measures. In other words, picture a scale with the two sides. Okay? What cheaters used to do when they'd weigh out like a pound of grain and then weigh it out with like a pound of gold, they would put a few extra weights on one side so they could get a little extra gold. That's how they used to cheat people back then. That's what this phrase, the measure you use, the scales you use, will be the scales that are used against you. So when you look at this in context of both of the verses, I think it actually makes a bigger argument to say, do not judge unfairly. Do not judge unreasonably. Do not cheat another person in your judgment. That, I think, is actually a better reading of verse 1. When it says, do not judge, I think it's actually it's a better reading. It's a more accurate reading with all of Scripture. Because Jesus and Paul in New Testament, Old Testament actually talks a lot about using judgment. So I think we have to understand that section first. Okay, now, don't believe me? If you're not entirely convinced yet, that's okay. Okay, listen on. I have to put my glasses on so I can read. Here we go. Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own? How can you say to your brother, let me take the speck out of your eye, when all the time there's a plank in your own eye? You hypocrite. First, take the plank out of your own eye. Then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. And that goes for sisters as well. Okay? So did you get the picture? This is a really common metaphor that Jesus used. And he paints this picture. Okay, this is called hyperbole. This is called it's exaggeration. Because obviously we're not all walking around with giant sticks of wood, 2x4 sticking out of our eyeballs. That would be very uncomfortable. Okay? So what he says is, hey guys, you're looking at little specks in your brother's, your sister, your spouse's eyes, when all of a sudden you've got a gigantic 2x4 sticking out of your eye. What are you doing looking at the little speck? Deal with your 2x4 first. And here's the amazing thing. You know why he said you should deal with your 2x4 first? So you can see clearly to actually help your brother, your sister, or your spouse with the speck in their eye. Now, unfortunately, I cannot see clearly right now because I'm not wearing my glasses. So we're going to put those back on. You guys are just little blobs of color at this point. So do you get the picture of kind of this hyperbole, this example, this exaggerated example? I was trying to think, how do we capture the true nature of this, the ridiculousness of what Jesus is talking about here? Anyone else getting a little warm? Yeah, it's a little warm in the auditorium this morning. So how do we capture the true nature of the ridiculousness of talking about somebody's little speck when we've got a giant log? Okay. Now, have you ever been sitting around with someone and they had like a little speck, like a little stain on their shirt? Okay, like let's say like, there we go. A little, can you see it? Like a little thing of sriracha. Okay? And you so want to point it out. You're just like, stayed. Hello, nice to stain. Okay? And that you so want to point it out. And you want to make a big deal about it because there's this little speck of sriracha from when they ate lunch. Okay? But what if you were actually sitting there with a big, gigantic stain of sriracha on your shirt, and you wanted to make a big deal about their little speck? That's what Jesus is talking about. Think, like, how ridiculous is that? Wow, okay, these fumes, this is straw, wow. Okay, I did not anticipate this. Good thing I brought an extra shirt. Hang on for a sec. Remind me not to touch my eyes. I will be in agony. Did you guys know that sriracha gave out fumes? Whew. That is some strong stuff. Well, you get the point? That's the point Jesus is making here, is that we are covered in mess. We are covered in offensiveness. We have giant logs sticking out of our eyes. We have chests covered in sriracha. And we want to point out little tiny specks and little tiny stains in our spouse. And that's what defensiveness is all about. Defensiveness is your spouse kind of bringing up a speck and you breaking out the log. Defensiveness is your spouse, your partner, bringing up a little stain and you making a big point about their giant mess. And the problem with defensiveness, and this is where it kind of kills us, is that your defensiveness ignores your own offensiveness. That's the problem with defensiveness. Your defensiveness ignores your own offensiveness. We are all offensive. We all have giant logs and sriracha covered shirts. But when we get defensive, we ignore that. We start making it all about the other person. And the argument escalates. So Jesus' solution to this is our solution. Is deal with the log in your own eye. Deal with the mess on your shirt. Then you could actually be a help to your spouse. Then you could actually be a blessing to your partner. But until you do that, your defensiveness ignores your offensiveness. And then both people are fighting out of being offensive. And that's what an argument is. So you want the solution to Gottman's love killer? Is pay attention to your own offensiveness. Pay attention to the giant log in your own eye. Pay attention to the mess on your shirt. Don't try and defend it. Don't fight against it, but pay attention to it. So, how do you know when you're defensive? Okay, like the last couple weeks, I've got a few questions for you. So here's a little 4-question quiz. Okay, you ready for it? A little 4-question self-assessment. This is out of Gottman's book. And again, if this is helpful, go out and grab a copy on our info table. The only thing you have to promise is that you're going to go through these with your partner. So here we go. Here are 4 questions for you to follow. And these are yes or no. And keep track, okay? Spouses, don't keep track for your spouse. Don't do that, okay? Keep track for yourself. Here we go. First one, okay? I don't feel like I get credit for all the positive things I do. I don't feel like I get credit for all the positive things I do. So yes or no. All right. Number 2, to avoid blame, I explain how and why a problem arose. To avoid blame, I explain how and why a problem arose. Okay. Number 3, when my spouse complains, I usually complain back at them. When my spouse complains, I usually complain back at them. Number 4, okay? It seems that all my partner can do is find fault with me. Okay? It seems that all my partner can do is find fault with me. Tally up. If you answered a couple of these or more, then you've got a healthy dose of this love killer in you. Okay? And it's probably a pretty big part of your marriage as well. So if you answered yes to more than a couple of these, then it's time to start paying attention to the log in your own eye and the mess on your own shirt. Okay? So how do we do this? Okay, that's great. Thanks, Pastor Greg. But how do I do this when I'm in the middle of a fight? Well, the last couple weeks, we've passed out some cards. And so I'm going to actually give you 2 tools. Okay, so before the cards, I'm going to give you the first tool. Okay, I'm going to give you 2 tools on how you can handle this. Ready? So the first tool, this one's from Gottman. Okay, the second tool, this one's from Pofor and I. Okay, so here we go. What Gottman says, the solution to defensiveness is accepting responsibility. Accepting responsibility. Okay? Now, in every argument, both of you have done something wrong. Okay? I've never seen a completely one-sided argument. The reason it's an argument is both of you are kind of blowing up at each other. Okay? I've never seen a one-sided argument. So that's the first thing you have to accept, that in every argument, both of you have some offensiveness. And remember, defensiveness ignores your offensiveness. And so what Gottman says is, pay attention to your offensiveness. In other words, don't argue back or defend or make excuses or bounce rubber and stick on you. None of that. Okay? Instead of playing innocent, just accept more responsibility. And so for some of you, that might mean taking responsibility for raising your voice and fighting back. For some of you, it might mean taking responsibility for messing up. Some of you, it might mean taking responsibility for the really angry things you thought in your head but didn't say, and you were really proud of yourself that you didn't say them. But you still have to confess these thoughts in your head. Okay? So Gottman's solution is to accept responsibility, even if it's a little bit. Even if it's like 99% their fault, own up to your 1%. Own up to your 1%. Because it's amazing what happens in a conversation, in a fight, when one person owns up to their part. It de-escalates a fight. And we've seen it plenty of times, and it's amazing to watch a fight just almost instantly de-escalate when one person just owns up. Right? So admit your log. Admit your mess. Admit your part. So that's the first piece of advice of how do we live out Jesus' command. Okay? Here's the other piece of advice I have. And this one comes from something Pafo and I learned early in our marriage. So all of those years where she was critical and contemptuous and I was defensive and stonewalling, we learned from our church some really valuable skills about how to live out what Jesus called us to live out. Okay, and if you've been around, we've got some little cards here, and you've probably seen, if you've been here any of the last couple weeks, you've probably seen these little cards. If you haven't gotten one or you want more, we're going to pass them around. And so on these little cards, on one side, remember 2 weeks ago we talked about criticism, and the solution to criticism was affirmations. So on one side of this card is this little model of how to do affirmations. Now, on the back side of this card, last week we talked about contempt. Okay? And with contempt, I said you should do affirmations because contempt is all about insulting your partner. Okay? For criticism, rather than making you statements, you did this, you're irresponsible, you're controlling. You make I statements, and that's what one half of the card is, where it says I statements, where instead of saying you did this, you said I feel this way. Now, the other half of I statements and what's on the back side of this card is what's called reflective listening. And this is actually a really common listening technique, but this is one of the best ways to avoid defensiveness. Because usually when someone says, if you're kind of feeling a little wound up and someone says, I feel left out when you make plans without me. And then the defensiveness kicks in and you start going at it and be like, you weren't around, I had to make decisions, you would have said no, all the defensiveness, okay? What reflective listening on this little card, so have these guys, we've got plenty of these, put one in your wallet, put them in your car, I don't know, tape them to your forehead if you really need help with this, okay? Pafo and I actually lived for 3 years with one of these taped onto or magnet onto our fridge. That's how helpful it was, okay? So the other half of this is reflective listening. So rather than getting defensive and saying, it's not my fault, when someone says, you forgot to take out the trash, instead of coming back and saying, it's too cold out, I'll wait till tomorrow. Okay? You come back with reflective listening, which says you listen to what they say and then you repeat it back to them. Okay, what I heard you say is you were disappointed when I forgot to take out the trash. What I heard you say was you felt left out when I made plans without you. What I heard you say was, you feel disrespected when I make jokes about you in public. That's reflective listening. And so believe it or not, on this little 3-inch by 2.5-inch card are 3 tools that you could use to live out God's desire for your marriage. Right here. So take as many of these as you want. That sense of reflective listening is one of the best things that we learned how to do to help us avoid defensiveness. And I believe it can help you as well. So if you have a really hard time looking at your own log, if you have a really hard time admitting to your mess, reflective listening and taking responsibility is the way around that. Let me pray. God, you give us a high calling to love our spouses and our partners in ways that almost seem impossible. So we need your help. Lord, we want to turn to you for the help to love our spouses and love our partners in the way that you would want us to. Not defending ourselves, not attacking, Lord, but loving and listening. So God, help us rely on you. Help us rely on you to not react defensively, but stay engaged. Lord, you don't want any of our love to be killed. And we confess to you our defensiveness. Lord, I confess my own with Pafoa even this week. And on behalf of our church, Lord, I bring them to you. And I confess their defensiveness and ask that you forgive us and restore us and give us another way of relating to our spouses.